Welcome, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here and good evening. I'm Violet Rose Arma. I'm Assistant Curator and Executive Assistant at the UAMA and co-curator of Bailey Doogan Ways of Seeing. I'm joined here by the wonderful art critic and writer Eleanor Heartney. And before we get into what is sure to be a fantastic talk, horror and humor, Bailey Doogan and the Feminist Revolution, I'd like to do our land acknowledgement. So we respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. The university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. This program is made possible by Alan Willenbrock and Dr. Peggy Jones, as well as many other generous donors, lenders, members, and patrons, and of course, our outstanding staff. I'm joined today, as I said, by Eleanor Heartney, who's going to delve into the work and significance of artist Bailey Doogan. Heartney has been writing about art since 1981 and is a longtime contributor to Art in America, contributing editor to Artpress, editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail, and has written extensively on contemporary art issues for Artnews, Artnet, Art and Auction, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Her most recent book is co-authored Mothers of Invention, The Feminist Roots of Contemporary Art. This talk is titled Horror and Humor, Bailey Doogan and the Feminist Revolution, and Heartney will look at how feminist ideas about the female body, power and gender, and pleasure and pain shaped Doogan's outlook and allowed her to create a striking body of original work that continues to resonate today. If you have any questions during the talk, we will be taking a few at the end. So please put those in the chat where I'll be able to monitor and then share those with Eleanor when she's finished with her talk. And so with that, I will hand it off to you, Eleanor. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Violet. And I'm delighted to be here, or here being in New York, but virtually with all of you. And it's really wonderful to be able to talk about this body of work and its significance and kind of the larger feminist issues that are inherent in the work. So without further ado, okay, we're going to do a screen share here, and I'm hoping that we can get this to work perfectly. And here we are. All right. I think are we good?
I am not seeing it quite yet. We'll
You
try
are
one
not
more
seeing.
time.
Uh-oh, that's bad. Just a minute here. Let's try it again. Okay. Oh, here, I think I have to hit this. Yes, I think that was the problem. Okay.
Yes, we're seeing it.
Okay, now, very good. Now I want to get, whoops, this is okay. I want to get the full screen here. Why am I not getting a full screen? Okay. Wait, whoop, well, okay. Um, yeah, there we go. What I did want a fuller screen, but I guess we can go with this. All right. So what I wanted to start, basically also sort of starting at the beginning of Doogan's career. One of a very important and formative experience was when she was working for an advertising agency, and one of the projects that she was given was to design the now iconic Morton Salt Girl. And I'm sure that you have all seen the Morton Salt Girl on Morton Salt. I mean, I grew up with it. And it was fascinating for me to discover that Bailey Doogan was the person who came up with this. And she wrote a very entertaining little essay about the creation of the Morton Salt Girl, which I think is also very illuminating in terms of her work and the direction that it took. She talked about how here she was, kind of this hippie girl, in this room of men in suits, basically trying to come up with, they wanted to update what had been a kind of long time logo for the company of this little girl with the salt. When it rains, it pours, pouring out of the back of her, the salt that as she walks with her umbrella. And apparently she went through dozens and dozens of different versions of the little girl. And, no, she's too old, she's too young, she's too this, she's too that. And many different versions until finally coming to the iconic version that we all know here. And one of the things that's very interesting about, and she talks about this a little bit, about this version, if you compare it to the ones those were a couple little samples that we were looking at, on the one hand, it's all about this kind of cute innocence of this little girl, but then there's this whole other little edge to it. You see, unlike in the other two drawings here, as you can see here, that the skirt is slightly lifted up. There's a little bit of a, kind of reveal here. And then there's also something about the open umbrella that also that there's something, it's hard to put your finger on something kind of salacious. And I think that, especially now in this era of Jeffrey Epstein, we are all kind of very conscious of the way in which, the sort of the kind of perverse eroticism of little girls can be exploited. And so, this Morton Salt girl, sort of the whole process of creating this image, I think was very formative for her in a lot of ways. She was, she was interested. She said at one point that the three biggest influences on her art were, first of all, this advertising world that she had been a part of, and realizing the ways in which sort of these symbols have power, and the symbols have these kind of other hidden meanings, and the way that they can be used to exploit people. And then also, besides that, she was interested. She talked about how. Another influence, of course, was Catholicism, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit as well, and also the feminist movement. So these three things came together for her to create, I think, the context for the body of work that we're going to be talking about. Now, what I thought I would do with this lecture was to talk about her work in connection with other feminist artists and some of the feminist ideas that are embodied in the work. Because one of the things that, I guess her kind of, although she had many different styles and went through a lot of different kinds of work, the constant was this focus on the body, the representation of the female body, and the way that representation deals with issues of power, sexuality, gender relations, and identity. And so that sort of keeps coming up again and again. And so anyway, I thought it would be interesting to look at some of her work in a context of some of these other women artists who have also been wrestling with these same issues. So I thought I'd begin actually with a couple of male artists, because especially in the 1970s and the time in which Doogan was working on the little Morton Salt girl, women were endlessly pictured in art and advertising, but they were pictured in a way, kind of sex and sort of innuendo and eroticism as a way of selling things. Now, this became a subject for a number of male pop artists, Tom Wesselman being one. And this is just a kind of representative image of his. And you see here, that the woman is sort of reduced to this kind of open, sexy lips. And then, this kind of very phallic image of the cigarette, and the cigarette smoke. In a similar way here, the James Rosenquist image here. You see again, there's something very kind of phallic about this. He's sort of just zoomed in on the mouth of the woman, the lips, those red, luscious lips, and then, this top of a Coke can or a pop, probably Coke, I would imagine, and sort of, dripping with, it's all very kind of sensual and sexual. So, male artists in the 70s were really looking at this whole question of kind of sexuality and advertising, but of course, from a very male point of view. But there were women pop artists as well, some of them not as well known as the male artists. But they also were engaging with this, but with I think a real difference. So, for example, here, Marjorie Strider, a very interesting pop artist from, again, here from the 1960s. And again, you like the Wesselman and the Rosenquist, here's this sort of glamorous image of this woman, very sort of sexy and sexual. And here she is, and here's the again the lips, those lips that seem to be so important to these advertising images. But she's chewing down not on a cherry or not on some sort of sweet, luscious thing, but on a radish. So there's a kind of little edge here, the radish. It's sharp, it's bitter. It's not exactly, that kind of very inviting image that one might associate more generally with these kinds of advertising images. And I thought I'd pair that with this work by Doogan, which again, it's the female, the woman here is it's this kind of sexy, sexual, Hollywood-like woman, very kind of erotic again. But there's an edge here. She's putting on her lipstick, but the lipstick is sort of dripping like blood. And of course, the lipstick itself is unmistakably phallic. So it's kind of very playful way of looking at, this pervasiveness of this use of sex basically to sell commodities. Um, and I wanted to talk about that. So, another sort of aspect of this, a lot of women artists have looked at the way in which, kind of advertising and not just advertising, art, even high art, has been the tendency to sort of equate women with, kind of, well, not only with commodities, with food, with, consumables. So, for example, this work by Lisa Yuskevich, which is a more recent work, but I think really well sums up this idea of kind of woman as a kind of luscious, wonderful commodity for the consumption of the presumably male viewer. Or this work by Nikita Sanfal, which is again, we have this, kind of very a very, very celebratory image of a woman. She's very voluptuous. The colors are also kind of almost candy colored. But again, there's an edge here. The edge being, this snake that is wrapped around her. And of course, the snake is associated with Eve, and there's a whole kind of larger dialogue going on here. But it's also, I think, about a kind of sense of danger and warning, and that, these women are not simply to be reduced to, kind of pleasurable objects. And I thought that would be interesting to pair with this work by Doogan, Barrels of Fun, which again, it's got this sort of, very sexy Hollywood, almost pinup kind of quality. But of course, what is she wearing? She's wearing a cactus. It's prickly. It's very off-putting in a way. And so again, I think feminists would take these stereotypes. One of the things that happened, these stereotypes of the way in which the female body was presented in art and advertising, and then they would turn it on its head. They would put this little kind of undermining in it, so that when people looked at these images, it sort of stops you short, and it's not, in fact, just purely kind of this promise of pleasurableness, and therefore, giving the woman here a lot more agency than one would find in, kind of the typical pinup that this seems to be in a way referencing. Um, One of the these kinds of ways of approaching the female body in art, it was something that a lot of feminist artists became very preoccupied with in the 70s and the 80s. And a lot of women were interested in the idea of the male gaze. There was a lot of theoretical discussion about this, the idea that Western art had been really organized in many ways around the male gaze looking at the female body. If you think about all the nudes, in Renaissance and post-Renaissance art, and the way in which kind of women are displayed as kind of objects of desire and sort of available to the presumably male viewer. So there was a lot of discussion about the idea of the male gaze, and feminists wanted to turn that around. For some women, some feminists felt that the only way to do that was to simply stop using the female body at all in art. But then there were other artists, and Joan Semmel, who we see here, is one of them, um, who took a different tack, who said, in fact, no, let's reverse the gaze. So no longer the male gaze, but let's explore what it would mean to have a female gaze. And so this is a work that's really kind of it's a dissertation on this whole notion of the male gaze. So on the one hand, you have over here, on the left, you have, kind of a female body that could very much be from, some sort of, pinup, softcore porn, whatever. The idea of the female body available for, the pleasure of the presumably male viewer. On the other side, you have one of Willem de Kooning's kind of very ferocious looking women paintings. And so the other sort of option is either the woman is totally pliant or the woman is harridan and totally frightening and scary. In the middle is Joan Semmel's take on the whole thing. Instead of a male gaze looking at the woman, she is looking at her own body down from her head, from her own eyes. And so it's reversing it and giving you, in fact, a female gaze. And it's an idea that she explored in a number of paintings. And again, here she did a number of paintings with her, with sort of her body entwined with her lover's body, but you never see the head. What you see instead is, the bodies as you would as you are looking down. And in here, particularly in this work, there is this sense of that this sort of very gestural sense that it's not the body as an object. There's something much more almost like, kind of the feeling. An effort to capture a sense of feeling rather than simply looking at the body as a body, kind of to get inside the body. And this is an idea which was also explored by the Austrian artist Maria Lasnik, who talked about she was interested in what she called body awareness, the idea of painting the body from the inside out. And so she did any number of self-portraits in which this was sort of the guiding principle. And part of the idea here was, how did it feel to be a body from the inside? And so, for example, she usually in these self-portraits, there's no hair because hair is not something you feel. You don't feel your hair. So it's the parts of the body that you feel. It's a different kind of interpretation of the body. And she was also, as I said, many self-portraits, thinking again about the idea of the male gaze. And here, I mean, if you want to talk about how do you challenge the male gaze, this one is I think, quite a challenge to the idea of the male gaze, and very confrontational rather than those kind of very pliant, seductive nudes that were so much a part of the Western art tradition. So I wanted to pair these with Doogan's, a couple of works by Doogan. Again, I think that kind of idea of body awareness, or how it feels to be inside a body rather than how it feels to be outside the body, looking at it as an object, is very much a part of this work. And also this is a work. It's a woman that her skirt is hiked up. She's bleeding. You see the menstrual blood. You see this idea of red, which is a color that actually Doogan used a lot to sort of signify kind of the inside. So again, this idea of sort of body awareness and viscera and kind of, and also the part of the woman's life that is perhaps not a part of the mythology of the kind of seductive temptress that again, part of advertising and art traditionally in the Western world. Or another example, I think I found this one is particularly interesting. So you have a woman here, and she's in a pose that, you might imagine in some, um, you know, maybe softcore porn. Again, this idea of the nude woman kind of looking available to the man in this sort of sexy pose. But the way in which she's presented, of course, totally negates all of that. First of all, you see how transparent her skin is. And again, this goes back to the Lasnik's idea of the sort of body awareness and the body from the inside out. And then there's also, excuse me, the red slip, which is a kind of, it seems to be here, um, sort of a displaced notion again of the blood. And so that the slip, which would be, in a kind of more conventional nude, that this would be the sort of, reference to the sort of the sexual nature, her sexual availability. But here it becomes something internal, something from inside. And I also sort of draw your attention to these kind of weird little creatures here on her arm and surrounding her arm. And kind of thinking back to Nikki de Saint Phalle and the snake and the idea again of, of a sort of sense of danger and threat, that this woman is not just available for your pleasure, but is that there is sort of much more, much more difficult things going on here. So, now, another strategy that was used by a lot of feminist artists was the idea of role playing, looking at gender roles. How do we think about gender roles, and are they natural? Are they innate? Are they pressed upon us by society? What does that mean? And in doing this, a number of feminist artists use the notion of theater as a metaphor, thinking about theater as a metaphor for gender roles. And one person in particular who did this was the artist June Leaf. When we see here her woman theater, and you have these figures who are, kind of puppets basically, and on strings, and some of them actually kind of look like her. And the idea of where this role playing and who is playing the puppets? Who is actually the puppet master here? And again, here it's a woman, but then she also seems to be playing herself. So it gets sort of very complex in a way. And another work by June Leaf here. Again, it's a kind of a little, almost like a little theatrical tableau here. Um, and it's called The Ascension of the Pig Lady. And she talked about how this particular work was inspired by this waitress, this kind of very ordinary looking waitress who she had met at I guess a diner that she used to frequent. And thinking about her, turning her into a kind of messiah figure. And as she says about this work, she said, if there was going to be another Messiah, it would appear in someone who would never expect it, like a waitress, and she would turn into a pig, a big pink pig. So it's a very equivocal kind of image. On the one hand, okay, so she's messianic, but on the other hand, the people that are surrounding her and the notion that she's a pig is very unclear. It doesn't seem to be a sort of traditionally triumphant kind of narrative here of this sort of ascension of Mary into heaven or whatever. So again, casting questions about to what extent are our roles preordained for us? To what extent do we have agency in the world? Um, and I wanted to talk about in this relationship a body of work by Doogan in which she played with the whole Punch and Judy tradition. Now, Punch and Judy, well, this I think going back to the 16th century, was a very popular kind of puppet show that these would be enacted in public spaces. And there's very sort of stylized narratives and it all revolved around Punch. You see Punch here, who was a clown-like figure derived from Commedia dell'arte, and who is basically he just beats the hell out of everybody around him. And he beats his wife, he beats and kills his wife, Judy, their baby, a policeman, a hangman, and even at times a devil. So, a very, kind of sexist narrative, of course, very much about kind of male power. But what Doogan has done, of course, is to flip it around. And as the title to this work suggests, you know, in fact, maybe Punch is thinking about whether, in fact, he really wants to be doing this. And Judy is here. She is floating through space, sort of attempting to break free. So part of the idea here of using the Punch and Judy is to kind of reverse these stereotypes again. And as I say, that was a technique that was being used by a lot of women artists, I think, to the idea of reversing stereotypes. Here, another one of Dugan's Punch and Judy images here. Here that Toby is the dog, and you can see that again. Here's Punch is got his stick. He's going to not clear who he's going to be. It looks like he's going to be beating Toby. Beating Toby. It looks like this is again Judy. Looks much more powerful actually than Punch in this particular image. So playing with this, talking about how it's about this whole Punch and Judy scenario, which was a very popular entertainment, was really about kind of the gender roles and power plays between the two genders, and how do you kind of flip that around? And it's actually a theme that was used by a number of artists as other artists as well. There, I just want to point to this work by Miriam Shapiro, another feminist artist, who is here. You can see a sort of shadow play using the Punch and Judy notion. Here, using it to talk about Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera and their kind of famously tempestuous relationship. And we see here in this case, Judy's got the stick. Judy's that seems to be the one doing the punching. So this, again, sort of questioning the nature of these roles. But then, of course, at the same time, wondering whether do we have to always fall into these kinds of roles, the dominant and the submissive, or is there another way to organize our relationships? Um, a similar kind of I think dynamic is going on in a number of works by Doogan, in which she uses the chair theme. And here you can see, this is a diptych, a woman and a man who have actually been transformed into chairs. Now, chairs have often been used in art as sort of substitutes or placeholders for people, for individuals. And here the people have actually become chairs. But there also in this particular diptych, there's this kind of sense of confrontation between these two, the chairwoman and the chairman. And you feel like, there's a power struggle that's going on here. And actually, Dugan's daughter Moira suggested to me that this was partly about Dugan's, she was a teaching at the University of Arizona, and it was an all-male faculty, and she kept butting heads with them. And so part of this is about the kind of struggles that she felt as, part of that faculty. And in this work, we kind of get a sense of where the whole thing ended up. The chair recognizes emotion from the floor. It looks like the chair has won here. The male chair has won. And again, this sort of power dynamic pinning her to the floor. So in a very playful way, using the chair theme and the idea of a kind of anthropomorphized chair to talk about this question of power in institutions and how we get sort of reduced often to this sort of, in this case, an object, not a sexual object, but a kind of almost an inanimate object. And I thought that it would be interesting to kind of think about the chair works in connection with this work by the artist June Leaf, who we saw before that she did also those theater pieces that I was talking about. And here, this is a piece, it's not exactly a chair, but it's a sewing machine, sort of an old-fashioned sewing machine. And part of what this is going on here, June Leaf used to talk about how she decided to become an artist because she would sort of sit underneath her mother's sewing machine as her mother was sewing. And the idea of making things on the one hand was sort of, became very exciting to her. But then there was also kind of the idea of wanting to escape from that sort of purely domestic role and do something other than, kind of just making clothes, instead becoming an artist. And so this work I think in many ways relates to that desire, and it's a kind of um, again, this idea of being, how do you escape from being confined to a particular role, a particular, being turned into a kind of object? How do you free yourself for another role? And here there's hope for freeing from that role, because you see here the wings on this figure is an angel, actually. So she's sort of fused with the sewing machine, but also, this possibility of escape, which is promised by the wings. And the wings, that sort of leads us to another strategy that a lot of feminist artists dealt with, which was playing with kind of mythological narratives, allegorical stories, using both kind of traditional mythological narratives and also creating their own private and personal mythologies. And again, here with Doogan, this is a strategy that Doogan used in some of her works. In this case, here she's talking about that in many ways, she's talking about this idea of kind of violence. Again, the same thing that we saw in the Punch and Judy works. And again, sort of to dissect this image, it's got a lot of different things going on. On the one hand, you see this woman, her body is transparent. Going back to that kind of idea of body awareness and sort of experiencing the body from the inside, and it's the organs almost sort of inside. Then you see this kind of very menacing looking clown figure who seems like he may be a descendant of Punch, sort of coming down towards her in a very threatening way. And then if you can sort of make out over here, this is actually sort of it's like a little dream image, or the kind of things you see sometimes in cartoons, is the little cloud. But what it is a representation of a Rubens painting of the rape of the daughters of Lysippus, which, and one of the things I think that Doogan is pointing out to here is, again, the way in which so much Western art, kind of plays on this idea of sort of domination of women, violence against women, the idea of rape. There's so many kind of paintings, mythological paintings about, Jupiter raping different, kind of nymphs and human females who he desired. And so she's kind of talking about that. And one of the things that she said about this painting is, this painting is my interpretation of Alida and the Swan, which was another myth about Jupiter, the king of the gods, raping, finding a human woman that he was desirous of and turning himself into a swan so that he could have his way with her. So this is my interpretation of Alida and the Swan theme, except that the swan is more a larval butterfly man. And of course, the painting is replete with phallic forms. And again, you can see that here. There's the cat tails, there's the pillars behind. So the whole thing is a kind of meditation using a mythological story, or a number kind of different mythological stories, to talk about this question of sort of violence against women, and and sort of, in a way, de-glamorizing the idea, because that had been so glamorized throughout kind of the Western art tradition. Another work that has a kind of very allegorical quality, not so specifically related to a particular myth, is this one, Leaving the Island. And here, what we see is, it also, I think, deals with this question of kind of physical violence against women, the kind of threat, physical threat. We see a woman, she is being menaced by this red man with a cane behind her, but is being carried away, carried off, hopefully escaping from this situation by this woman we have in the foreground, who you can see as a woman. She has breasts. So she's being rescued in a way. And yet at the same time, the situation still feels very threatening. And I thought it would be interesting to pair this with some works by some other artists, feminist artists, who've also used the kind of metaphor, I think, of the sea and the boat as a way to talk about both freedom and threat. So, for example, this work by Mary Frank here, this boat in the sea, this, of course, also, I think, like Doogan, using the color red in a very symbolic way. It feels very body-like. And we have these figures in here, and we see particularly this female figure holding on to the mast, or these others kind of leaning down towards the water. So there's this sense, okay, they're in a boat. Hopefully they're safe, they're being saved, they're being taken, rescued in some way. And yet at the other hand, there's also, it feels very threatened. You see this a similar thing in this work by Maria Lasnig, who we had seen before, the artist who was dealing with the idea of body awareness. And here you see the boat is down, sunken boat down at the bottom. She's being bitten by this fish. On the other hand, she's got a glass of wine. So it's really about sort of both freedom. The water is kind of both freedom and threat, freedom and danger at the same time. And this idea of this feeling of being, of basically trying to save yourself, trying to, swim through and save yourself, which is, I think, also a thing that runs through this work by Dana Schutz, a much more recent work. Again, you see the sharks down below threatening, and here piled in this boat, are these kind of very, again, this sort of heap of female, looks like they're all female bird-like characters. So the idea of being kind of unmoored, I think, being in a boat, being unmoored, very much a kind of a sense of being being afraid and yet also being possibly liberated. And one of the things that Doogan said about her painting, Leaving the Island, I think is very salient to this whole thing. She said that it was about the conflict of leaving a situation that's bad, but it's all you've ever known. And then she added, and I thought this was very interesting, for me, it's also very tied up with Catholicism. Now, as I said before, Catholicism was one of the one of the influences that she admitted to, the three important influences: the advertising, the Catholicism, and feminism. And I want to talk a little bit about that because, first of all, I have to say I also come from a Catholic background, and there is something about in Catholicism. It's very, you get very mixed messages basically about being a woman, being female, what your role is in life. On the one hand, there's the Virgin Mary is sort of this figure that you are meant to aspire to, and to you want her both to kind of shower her grace on you, but also sort of to be her in a way. She's a kind of role model, but she's a very equivocal role model because on the one hand she's a virgin, but she's a mother. I mean, she's all these kind of impossible things. And so a number of women artists who come from Catholic backgrounds have kind of wrestled with this question of how do you deal with this picture of the Virgin Mary? How do you deal with the way in which Catholicism, on the one hand, Mary is this incredibly important figure because she's the mother of God, she's the mother of Jesus, but on the other hand, she also is this kind of very powerless figure who has been taken over by God to be, the bearer of his child. And so this is a work by Kiki Smith called Virgin Mary, and she was thinking very much along these lines. And so she presented the Virgin Mary here as she's flayed, her skin is gone. You see instead the muscles, again, this idea of the body from the inside, something that a lot of feminist artists, I think, have been very preoccupied with. And Kiki Smith talked about this in terms of the idea that she wanted to present the Virgin Mary as someone who basically had been asked to submit everything to her whole essence, sort of given over to being, the mother of God, and the representation of that being her loss of her skin. And I thought it would be interesting to pair that with this work by Doogan, which is also, I think, very much about that sort of question of submission and presentation of yourself, that the feelings of of grace and yet also guilt. And the title of this piece, I think, is very telling. It's Mea Corpa. Now, in Catholicism, Mea is that strip? Are you guys seeing that strip also? I have a kind of weird strip here. I hope you're not seeing that. Um,
No, we don't. We just see the picture. You're good.
Okay, very good. I'm glad. So mea corpa is a kind of feminization of the idea of mea culpa, which is about talking about the body of Christ, mea culpa, my body. That he by giving his body in the crucifixion, and in Catholicism, there's a whole very complex theology that about kind of the relationship between the body and the soul, and Jesus as a embodied human being taking on the sins of the world, and then dying on the cross for the salvation of mankind. So it's partly a kind of, instead of it's a feminization of that, but it's also, I think it's also a reference to mea culpa, which is in the mass, is an admission of guilt, my guilt, my so it's about, again, this, I think this work is about this very complex relationship to Catholicism, that women in particular have, and particularly feminist women have, because there's the empowering notion of kind of the Virgin Mary, but then there's also this sort of emphasis on submission and guilt, and women are women responsible for the sins of the world, and so all of these things kind of get mixed up in there, and it was something that I think was important, and is conveyed as well by this work by Doogan. So then to come towards the sort of the final theme that I wanted to talk about here. Um, as you probably noticed here, and if you've been to see the show, you also notice that Doogan, that there's a lot of shift in her work, and particularly in her later work, it shifts from that much more expressionistic kind of paintings that I've mostly been showing here to these kind of very hyper realistic examinations of the mostly older female body. And this idea of kind of looking at the aging female body. Part of that, of course, she talked about that, saying that she had made that switch because in her later years she had a lot of problems with eyesight, with her eyes, and so she began to as she kind of lost the sight, other sensations become more acute, and so she's sort of thinking about her body, looking at it, examining her body in a much more minute way. And I think that what she does in a lot of the later works is very interesting in the context of the artist Joan Semmel. Now, I showed you her work earlier, her work, the female gaze, looking down from the body, her own body, down into her body and the body of her lover. In more recent years, she has turned her attention to her own body. And you see here she is, a lot of paintings actually of herself, taking a camera and really unflinchingly looking at what her body looks like as it is no longer kind of young and sexy, and no longer the kind of body that one, again, traditionally saw in Western art, all those voluptuous nudes. Here, another one here, touching toes. You see, again, kind of, and feeling her body. That a lot of it is, again, it's about not, again, this idea of body from the inside. How does it feel to be a body? Not necessarily how does it look to be a body. And so, that very much a theme in her work. And another artist kind of thinking in the similar way, Brenda Goodman, a number of self-portraits again. You see she's an artist, she's got her brushes, but again, this sort of unflinching look at the aging female body. And, the kind of talking about all of the codes that we have about the nude, and the way that in general, these are not the kinds of nudes that have been acceptable in the history of Western art and again, feminists sort of flipping the script in a way once again. And of course, so Doogan in her later years also undertook this same kind of very unflinching examination of her own body, and the ways in which she was aging. And part of it, it's not traditionally beautiful, and yet you look at these kind of close-up images and quite beautiful, the way that they're painted and the veins and the colors of the body, the different sort of bodily, the shapes and the shadows. So thinking about the body, it's not, it's not that nubile, seductress, for the male gaze body. It's a body, it's a lived body. It's a body that has been lived in. She did a number of works like this one. Again, the titles often of her works are really kind of great. Self-examination. And as I was saying, as she got older, her work in a way became sort of more tactile and more, it was about as much about the sense of touch as about the sense of sight. And so here is one of a whole series of works in which she is looking and examining her own body very closely. And I think these works are about, well, they're about a lot of things. Part of them are, it's about sort of self-acceptance. It's also about questions of what do we find beautiful? What do we mean by beauty? Why have we been, sort of so conditioned for that beauty, has to only be, for female beauty, it has to only be this kind of very young, a very, very short period of years in which the female body is beautiful, and then it's sort of invisible or not to be looked at. And so kind of this bringing acceptance and also a kind of sense of, again, reversing that, getting rid of the male gaze. It's a female gaze. This is a woman looking at a woman. This is how women look at women. This is what it means to have, a female gaze. And so I wanted to conclude with this work, which is kind of wonderful. This goes back to the Morton Salt girl that I began with, because of course here much later in her life, Doogan returned to this theme and here brought us this kind of wonderful image of the Morton Salt girl all grown up. And here she is, and she's no longer this sort of cute, innocent little girl, with a little kind of flip up of her skirt, sort of teasing you about what might be underneath. Instead, she's a full grown, mature woman, and she has taken on the power herself, and it's very sort of confrontational and full of her own kind of agency. She is not letting someone else define her anymore. And I think it's a wonderful kind of metaphor for the way, or it's a wonderful indication of the way in which Doogan took on the idea of the body, the female body, her own self-representation, and empowered herself through her art. So that is, let's see, that's what I had to show you. And let's see here. We can come back to, okay, I'm not even sure how do I get back
Oh,
to Zoom. Are
wonderful. Yes, we can see you.
okay,
Yes.
very good. Okay, excellent.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. I'm trying to see if we have any questions in the chat, but while maybe a few people are typing something that I thought about, before everyone was logging in, we were kind of talking about the reception for our show now here in 2026, and a lot of these works that you're showing are from the 1980s, and I'm just wondering, what the response was like at that time, if it, how it compares to present day, if you could speak to that a little
Oh,
bit.
yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting that, I mean, I feel like in a way we're doing a bit of a throwback because this question of sort of art and pornography was actually quite potent in the 80s. I remember, that, and there were a lot of women artists. There was a debate within actually the feminist community a lot about this question. Should you show the female body, or are you just playing into the whole thing?
Mm,
And so there were a number of women artists who deliberately played with pornography. But then, of course, they could run foul of the kind of larger community here. They're talking about, these larger philosophical issues, but, outside in the society at large, these things can then just get sort of reduced to, this is pornography. Yes, this was actually kind of a very potent issue back in the 80s. And so it's interesting to see it coming up again. My understanding is that, that there's a wonderful book that's coming based on the, not just the exhibition, but of Doogan's whole career, which ran afoul of the first printer who thought that the works were pornographic. Happily has found another printer, and so it will be published. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we go through these phases, I think. There's sort of cycles that society, excuse me, that society goes through. And it's also about kind of, I guess, a distrust of art and sort of a reduction of art to sort of the obvious in a way. I mean,
mm.
it's often hard for people to see, art has so many layers and that's what makes it different than pornography. So,
Yes, absolutely. I think, when you look at a lot of the work, especially, thinking about coming from the art world versus like a general public perspective, thinking about, kind of the shock factor. Someone may have never seen an image like that before, but there's so much that is being said there besides, that immediate moment, I guess.
yeah.
And
Well,
we,
yeah. And I mean, things like Michelangelo's David, have been censored. I mean, it's like,
yes, I
so it's,
know.
it's also about sort of discomfort with the body. And part of what the feminist movement was about was, to kind of confront head on that discomfort with the body that is so much a part of our culture.
Yes. All right. And we have a few questions here. So I'll say a few of them. So from Corey McGraw, she was wondering about your interpretation of pour it on. Is she leering at a man? Who is she beckoning? Any thoughts about that?
Which work? Which one are you talking about?
For pour it on. So
Oh,
the
yes,
Morton
pour it on.
Salt
Yeah,
romance.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I think. Yeah, in some ways, I have a feeling that she is addressing all those suits, those men in suits who tormented her when she was trying to come up with the Morton Salt girl. Yeah, I think it's definitely got that sort of confrontational thing, and it's like, and they wanted it to be, like a little bit erotic, but not too erotic, and all of this, and then she's just like, okay, you know. Here you are. Yeah, I would say, at least one interpretation for me would be that.
Yes, I agree. And if you or anyone is interested in Corey and others, there's a article that Bailey Doogan wrote called Logo Girls that kind of dives into what that whole process was like and probably provides some insights
Right.
on that. And then Roberta Kurtz asked, do you know if she personally knew Joan Simmel, I think is who they were referring to here.
Yeah, I don't think so. Because they were, it's funny, the feminist movement and the art world actually at that time, and even to a certain extent now, it's sort of geographically separated. So Joan Semmel is a kind of New York-based artist, and Bailey Doogan, was a West Coast-based artist, and I don't know for sure, but I kind of doubt it actually, which is also very interesting because it also, a number of the artists that I've talked about probably didn't know each other, but these threads or these ideas were what were sort of running through, I guess the feminist art movement at the time. And so yeah, very interesting that, like, so for Joan Semmel, there's such a there is such a compatibility between her work and Dugan's work. But no, I don't think they did.
Yeah, I'm not certain either, but something that was interesting is we did art trivia last week, and my counterpart who I do it with, Lauren Rabb, who used to be curator at the UAMA and was the founding curator of the healing art program at the Tucson Medical Center here in Tucson. She actually brought that as a her Joan Simmels as a counterpart to kind of discuss
Yeah.
Doogan's work, which I thought it was interesting. You mentioned her, and I also thought all of the overlapping symbols were very interesting. You know, you showing like the chair and the boat, all of these symbols we see in Doogan's work and how there were like overlaps with artists of the time. And let's see if there were, oh yes, clarifying. So just to speak a little plug for the book about Doogan's work that's coming out that I'm so excited to get my hands on. It's Luminous Bodies, the Art of Bailey Doogan. So the binder censored it, not the printer. So they were printed, and then when they were sent to the bindery is when the issue came up. So, but now they're sent off to a new binder who has agreed to do the project. But it is interesting, you know, this idea of history repeating itself with these, you know, images that are not, you know, intended to be seen in this like
Mhm.
sexualized way, like you were saying throughout the talk, being interpreted as such and then, you know, kind of shunned in that
Mhm.
way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh yes, just more comments in agreement. Yes, I also can't wait to read the book. There's some fantastic essays in there that I can't wait to read as well. And it was wonderful too to see some examples of work that we have in our show here, as well as some that we do not, you know, selections that we didn't pick from certain series just due to space and all of these things. A lot of Doogan's works are very large for those of you who aren't super familiar with her work. And I don't see any other questions. So if you have any, while we're kind of wrapping up here, um, before I let everyone go and send us off, I want to thank Eleanor so much for sharing her expertise and time with us, sharing so much information that I certainly did not know, even in doing the research for this exhibition, and all of these wonderful connections. So thank you so much for that. And I also wanted to remind all of you of a few virtual and in-person events coming at the UAMA. So our next art trivia is 2 weeks from today. And the theme is getting cozy. So even though it's not cold here in Tucson, I'm sure it is in New York and other places people are tuning in from. So we're embodying that energy a little bit, and that will be on February 19th at 5 p.m. Arizona time. And then after that, our next in-person event is in collaboration with Odyssey Storytelling. That's a wonderful nonprofit here in Tucson. That will be from 5:30 to 7 at the Center of Creative Photography, exploring the theme Our Bodies Are Full of Stories, which is inspired by a quote by Bailey Doogan. And then if you are a member, or maybe you want to become a member, we have a very exciting special tour coming up this Saturday of the Bailey Doogan exhibition at Etherton Gallery in Tucson. That is Bailey Doogan Close to the Bone. And that will be at 11 a.m. this coming Saturday, the 7th. So lots of excitement coming up. Um, thank you all so much. Thank you for your wonderful support. And again, thank you so much, Eleanor, for participating and doing this. It was wonderful.
It was fun to do. Thank you.